Okay, so I live in the United Arab Emirates, and before I moved here, I taught people from the various Gulf countries, Middle East and North Africa, and also Asia, like Afghanistan and Pakistan, sometimes looking at Egypt and Morocco and like this. So I decided to choose these two countries because this is the majority of my student population. I'm an ESL teacher, so of course it helps me to know as much about the language and cultural context of my learners as possible, which is how all of this began. So you can see these two countries, a lot of people believe that it's the same group of people because they were migratory patterns between the different coasts. So people assume that the culture is the same and that the governments are quite friendly. So let's take a look. I'm hoping this is working. Okay, so in Saudi Arabia, the country was formed long before United Arab Emirates became transitioned from the trucial states and became a country that was United Federation of Monarchies. So Saudi Arabia is just a singular monarchy. The royal family is Al Saud with Sidiris as the princes and the people that they marry. So it's two tribes that sort of melded together. Um, and the monarchy has total control. It's basically an absolute monarchy. Uh, their urbanization rate is only 83%, which is a lot compared with the countries that have similar populations like India, Bangladesh, like this. Uh, and you can see that the labor force is much higher than United Arab Emirates, but the population is also a bit larger. You can see the population is, it says 27 million citizens on CIA fact book, but inside of the country, they think they report with each other in their own ministries that it's much more like 18 million. Um, but it's really difficult because not everyone is registered, not everybody has legal documentation, particularly when you get outside of the cities, anything goes. Uh, so it says that on the CIA fact book that the population is 50% Arab and 10% Afro-Asian. Part of this is because it's quite difficult to estimate exactly what's going on with the people. Uh, Slavery was only outlawed in Saudi Arabia in the 80s, and a lot of the men who were leaders of their family, the patriarch of the family, would have children, officially or unofficially, with the slaves that they held. So the families of slaves were interwoven into the prominent families and even the poor families. So in the cases of the poor families, when slavery was outlawed, the people just remained in poverty. In the cases of the wealthy families, where there was blood mingling, in order to avoid scandal, bribes or financial compensation was made, or houses were given, etc., to try to placate the family. So the wealthy slaves were treated with respect and given positions in society, and the poverty-driven slaves were just driven further into poverty. So they remain discriminated against and viewed as an underclass. So there's always some degree of suspicion there is no intermarrying between the races in Saudi Arabia. That is not the case in United Arab Emirates. So you can see that there's really no accounting for exact numbers of Sunni versus Shia because it's illegal basically to be Shia. It's considered to be blasphemous. So if you actually admitted it and registered as such with the government, you'd be painting a target on your back. So people generally don't admit it. So these are just guesses based on attendance at local mosques. So people say in this masjid 50 people come every Friday for sermons. So they assume that it's the same 50 people and that's what it represents. So again, talking about populations, legal migrants, legal residents, all of these questions are quite uncertain because there's really no tracking. There's insufficient technology and cooperation to develop that far. Okay, with the laws and courts, in Saudi Arabia, the Grand Mufti is responsible for interpreting and applying Quranic law to modern life. So questions are raised to him, he reads everything, he considers it, and then he makes a ruling. So he is the sort of the Pope of Saudi Arabia, so to speak. Then the courts will consider what his rulings were and weigh cases against that. The problem is the courts, the jurists are judge, jury, and hangman. So there's not any requirement to have representation, due process, any of those things. So in issues of civil affairs, it can be rather straightforward. But in issues of criminal affairs, where it's not like civil disputes over businesses or you ruined my car so you have to replace it, or blood money like this for accidentally killing someone or whatever. But in cases where there's criminal accusations like terrorism or blasphemy or other grievances against the government, the people can be punished by death. They don't have to have any kind of representation or fair trial. They can be tortured indefinitely into giving confessions. There are no human rights observances there. So the lower courts, they might say this guy who kissed a woman he's not married to gets 3 weeks in prison, but this woman who kissed a guy that she's not married to will be thrashed 500 times and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Prison conditions in the Middle East are not like the United States or even like Europe. Food is not provided and medical care is not necessarily provided either. So in addition to all of the usual sexual violence, drug abuse, physical abuse that happens in prison systems, you've got the factor that you have to do whatever it takes to get food. Your family may not have access to you, or you might not have family to bring you food. So the justice system is quite harsh. In Saudi Arabia, they've made great efforts to try to figure out their literacy rates and school life expectancy. However, literacy rates is being able to identify letters of the alphabet. It is not spelling your name consistently. It is not being able to write a sentence. It is not being able to read a sentence. Typically in a high school in Saudi Arabia, the students will take an 8-question or 25-question multiple choice test. That is the most that's ever demanded of them. If they fail that exam for that class, they can repeat it 5 times. They're given a copy of it to study and review, and they can continue repeating it 5 times before they're considered to have failed the class. And the passing rate is simply 50. It is not 60 or 75 like you might find in the West. Girls have a longer school life expectancy for those who enroll. We don't know how many don't enroll because in Saudi Arabia you can be married at the time that you hit puberty at 8 years old or 7 years old, and of course then you'd be withdrawn from school and disappear off of the radar. So there's a lot of difficulty in tracking how many girls actually make it into school because a lot of girls aren't registered at birth. The major issues are looking at security, domestic terrorism. Basically, anything can count as domestic terrorism. It doesn't have to be an attack. It doesn't have to be ISIS. It doesn't have to be a political group. It can be anyone who says anything against the religious police, the clerical class, or the royal family. There is no freedom of speech. It's been totally banned since the situation with the Arab Spring. The major issues of drug trafficking, if Saudis are involved, they'll get a slap on the wrist. If people from Pakistan or Nigeria are involved, they're tortured and then killed. And human trafficking, of course, is a big issue, especially in all of the Gulf, especially from the countries of conflict. They put the women into shipping containers, they bring them in by sea, they don't have documents for them, they pile them into apartments, they literally lock them inside the apartments, and sometimes they are able to escape through a window or something and they jump to their death. So when their bodies are found, no one can identify them. Sometimes they find bodies in dumpsters. Of course, it's never in the media because it's considered shameful to admit that they have prostitutes. Okay, in UAE, their urbanization rate's a little bit higher, but the population's a lot smaller, and part of their urbanization is having all of the people from basically Abu Dhabi is Little England. There are more people from England than there are from any other country in Abu Dhabi. Dubai is much more international, and I live in Sharjah. It's about 12 miles north, but it's a 2 to 3 hour commute each way. And in my emirate, Sharjah, there are 8 men from India or Pakistan for every human being who is not. So generally, as a woman from the West, I am the only person in like a square kilometer radius that is not from India or Pakistan. And I receive a lot of discrimination and threats against myself if I'm outside. Uh, if I'm in a mall or in Dubai, it's different. But if I'm just walking to the dry cleaner, which is 2 blocks away, or to the Pakistani bakery to get long bread, the people in the shops are having appropriate behavior, but the people who are walking on the street do not. Um, you can see that the labor force in UAE is much smaller than Saudi Arabia. Generally, girls go to school to make them more marriageable. They don't have any intention to graduate or actually work, although the demand for that is quite real. The problem in UAE is that the eligible men tend to seek out rich men and have relationships together to receive material benefits, because the men in the families, the boys, the teenagers, the college-age kids, are responsible for providing for their sisters. So part of their salary is divided always. So if they make $2,000 a month, automatically 500 goes to the father and 500 goes to one of the sisters in the family. So he's responsible for supporting his father and also his sister. The rest of the money he has to spend on housing. So he's always cash poor. Another situation in UAE is the driving system. If you get 12 points on your driving license, which means 4 speeding tickets or 3 speeding tickets and 4 parking tickets, some combination of these sorts of violations, your car cannot be registered to your driver's license anymore, which means you have to give it away to someone in your family or it gets impounded. So they are continually taking loans from the bank to purchase new vehicles. So it's quite typical for a 22-year-old kid in college to have 5 car loans, and he's trying to make payments on all of them. So he will seek a wealthy sheikh who is interested in having relationships with men. He will be a boyfriend, and he will be given all of the things that give him a higher standard of living, so that his family can parse out what he gets from his own position in the military. And the majority of, because it's national conscription, the majority of the guys are working in the military, with a smaller portion working in the police. This creates a lot of contention in families, because the women get married, they discover that the guy is having an affair with another guy or has 8 girlfriends on the side, using prostitutes, etc., because he's basically been living in a society that has no boundaries for him, and she gets hurt, and she's already had 2 or 3 babies. She tries for divorce many times. Her father won't accept her back because he doesn't want the financial burden, etc. People typically retire after 10 years of work. They think that that's a full career. It's very unusual to find someone who's doing 15 or 20-year careers here. They generally depend on their children as soon as their children are old enough to earn. And they live far beyond their means. The houses that they have, the compounds that they build, are what we would see like at the Newport mansions in Rhode Island. And they're not normal quality of construction, but the idea of living lavishly is valued to separate the people who are Emirati from the non-Emiratis, much more so than you would see in Saudi Arabia. Again, you can see the median age is quite low, so the majority of both countries have a population of people who are college age or very young professionals or teenagers. Part of this is because generally as people age, they don't seek medical intervention. They believe it's fate that they die, or God's will. Okay, in UAE, they've got a different kind of court system than Saudi Arabia, because they don't have a Grand Mufti. There's a Majlis Council where you can submit requests to interpret fatwas or consult about the legitimacy of a fatwa or seek advice about how certain principles will apply to situations. So there's not a reference that works the same way with a singular body. So this group, this Majlis, is flexible, it's fluid, it changes, and their interpretations of fatwas also change, but this is the guiding governance for the population. Their court system, they're trying to develop more parity with international law, but of course they want to maintain absolute control so that there's fear among the population, so that there's no uprising and ousting. And there's quite a lot of tension between some of the federations, or some of the families in the federation. So there's always tribal competition, economic competition, and because it directly affects their personal status and wealth, it's taken very seriously. So, for example, there's conflicts over territory and territory resources, and things get quite nasty, and it affects the local population. With the Situation in UAE, it's much more tolerant of diversity than Saudi Arabia because they depend on the business, the tourism industry, to supplement what they're not getting in petrol dollars. Because only one emirate, Abu Dhabi, produces oil. All of the other emirates depend on business for their income. It's not like Saudi Arabia where there's oil all over the place and it's a much higher export dollar. So they're trying to manage